Welcome, welcome back, and welcome to our Zoom friends. Sorry for that label. Our friends virtually. You've been with us for several days, and this is the grand finale of integration of science, wisdom, and experience. And I'm grateful that Richie agreed to lead an hour, an eclectic hour, not a lecture, not a meditation, but really sharing with us some of his work, his center's work, as well as some of the experiences that embody the science of mindfulness, compassion, and as he said, with these practices, the impact at many, many levels can be measured, but the origin of them was not targeted for health. And it's just so amazing that we're so unified in mind and body that they are health practices. Richie, as you know, he's a friend and a mentor of many people here. I just learned that Julian was a trainee in his lab too. There's just so many, just a web of connections in our world. And I love when it reveals itself. And I think Richie probably needs no introduction. I will just say that I am so inspired and grateful by his work over so many decades to bring the science to the public culture and culture change. And I loved the example from Carlos today, coming back from the ER room with meditation on the prescription. So it was a good example of impact of the field of our work and of Richie really as a pioneer and leader in this with a real mission to ease suffering. Thank you, Richie.
Thank you, Madison. One of the feelings I've been having over the course of this weekend is a feeling of just a kind of interpersonal warmth with this community. And I recognized that we all share something in common other than our common humanity. And what is it that we share? We share a friendship with Alyssa. And so I'd like to begin with a practice. And if you all sit in whatever posture feels comfortable and supported, you can keep your eyes open or closed, whatever is most comfortable. And I'd like us to first begin by actually bringing Alyssa into our mind and to this really extraordinary gathering that has been assembled. And let's spend a few moments allowing this sense of appreciation to emerge. And also to all of those who have helped support this meeting. To Quinn, to the AV staff, to the cooks, and all of the others who have provided for our comfort, our security. And if you see any of these people, what might you say to them to express your gratitude? For those of you whose eyes are closed, you can please open them now. This is an example of something I'll talk about in a little while that we have been calling a micro-intervention. How many of you right at this moment feel any differently from when you first walked into this room and sat down? Okay. So it doesn't take much to nudge the system toward well-being. So I'm going to give a talk, and I'll sprinkle it with a few practices. And the talk is really about this idea that well-being is a skill, and everything that we and many other scientists have done lead us inevitably to this conclusion. And one of the central messages of this talk is that if we believe that the science supports this, and of course there are still many unanswered questions, exactly how to do it and how it might be different for different kinds of people, and what is an optimal dosage of practice, and all of these other really interesting and important questions that we still have to figure out. But if we believe that well-being can be cultivated, and if we recognize what the distal impact of that might be, we have a moral obligation, in my view, to act to promote well-being in the world. And in addition to being good scientists, we need to be activist scientists, just as climate scientists have become activist scientists. And it is only, I think, through that kind of collective action will the world begin to change in the ways that I think all of us aspire it to change. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this journey. I'm going to sprinkle it with a bunch of data, mostly not from our lab, although some from, to marshal support for this basic message. And I want to begin by situating this in a little biography. One of the inspirations in my life and the honors that I've had has been to spend quite a bit of time, of course, pre-COVID, with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And the Dalai Lama has been really critical. And at one point early on in my relationship with him, I've known him for about 25 years. This was in about the year 2000. He took me by the arm and he said, I want you to take the practices from our tradition, turn them into a form that anybody can practice, a more secular form, if you will. Investigate them with the tools of modern science. And if you find them to be valuable, disseminate them widely. That is my assignment for the remainder of my time on this planet. And so we will begin there. This is a picture that was taken in 2001 of His Holiness visiting our lab in Madison. This was at the beginning of the days of brain imaging. This is 2001. And we were showing him how functional MRI works. And that's a whole amazing story. And if anyone is interested, they can ask me about it later. But it was, there were some really unexpected things that occurred during this demonstration. And so he has really been the inspirer in chief of all of this work. Now, I want to spend the first few minutes just very briefly reviewing what all of you know, but just as a stage setter and a reminder of the urgency of this need, the crisis of well-being and its devastating interdependent consequences. So I'm going to go through this quickly. This is work that you all know, but it's helpful to see it, I think, assembled together. Distractibility, rates of ADHD. This is in the US. Just looking at trends over time, showing increased rates of ADHD. Of course, there are many explanations for this, and we can talk about that and debate that later. But most scientists and clinicians would agree that these rates are increasing. Anxiety disorders. This is in a sample of more than 400,000 people in the United States, and this is looking at different age groups, and particularly in the younger age groups, which are in the line that's precipitously increasing, you see these trend lines. This is data that was recently published on worldwide increases. This is in 37 different countries, worldwide increases in loneliness. And we know that loneliness is a greater risk factor than obesity for mortality. These are data showing the disturbing trends in depression and also illustrating the gender difference, which is pernicious, and it's found in every culture, every Western culture in which it's been investigated. And this is true in teens as well. These are data from the CDC, and you can see the gender difference is only getting worse. Suicide is also showing very disturbing trends. Just reading from this abstract, nationally, the suicide rate among persons aged 10 to 24 was stable from 2000 to 2007 and then increased 57% from 2007 to 2018, and so on. And it's even more urgent as a consequence of COVID. These are data from a paper in the JAMA Open Network, just showing, comparing pre-COVID and during COVID rates of depression. And you can see that both mild, moderate, and severe depression are very significantly higher during COVID compared to pre-COVID times. And then a paper that just came out in Lancet on October 8th, just a few days ago, looking at the global prevalence and burden of depressive and anxiety disorders in 204 countries throughout the world. If you look on the left, there are females, on the right are males, and the tan data are data from during COVID, and the blue data are data from before COVID, and you can see these rates are much higher during COVID than before COVID, particularly in females, and this is true throughout the world. This is a heat map showing the prevalence of depression during COVID throughout the world, and you can see in many parts of the world, this is the change in prevalence from pre to during COVID. These are astronomically increased percentages in certain parts of the world. And I felt that it was really important to include the fact that our climate change crisis is at least in part driven by our incessant thirst for growth and consumption. And if you look at the data on the left is showing relative changes in GDP, that's the red line, in relation to measures of environmental indicators, fossil fuel consumption. And you can see that the rates of the increases in GDP are highly correlated with the rates of fossil fuel consumption. And the figure on the right is these authors' suggestion for what a sustainable lifestyle might be. We'll talk about that later. But one of the things that we know is that increases in GDP are not associated with increases in well-being. These are 50-year data showing that the rise in GDP in the United States is not associated with any change in average happiness or an index of consumer sentiment. Also, one of the other crises that we face is a susceptibility to misinformation. These are findings that were published in the Royal Society Open Science Journal recently, and it's about misinformation pertaining to COVID, and specifically looking at the predictors of whether a person is agreeable to receiving a COVID vaccine. And I won't bore you with the details of this data, but on the bottom, what you see is a measure of susceptibility to misinformation, and this is looking at the, it's a logistic regression looking at the odds ratio for whether a person is going to get vaccinated, and the negative numbers to the left of the vertical line mean that there's a reduced likelihood to get vaccinated. And so what these data are showing is that those individuals who are more susceptible to misinformation are less likely to get vaccinated. I mean, it's not a surprise, but it raises the important issue of susceptibility to misinformation. Our well-being is in rapid decline, and well-being matters. That's something you all know. These are data showing that higher levels of well-being predict increased life expectancy across 151 countries. These associations are very robust. Now, when Martin Luther King gave this famous speech, when conditions were really devastating, the title of his talk was not, "I Have a Nightmare." Having a dream of the possibility of living differently, having a vision of what living with well-being might be to guide our future is so important, particularly in the face of all of these challenges and misinformation and difficulties that we all face. Now, some of you may recognize this dude on the left. He was the director of the National Institute of Mental Health for 13 years. Tom Insel, I consider him a friend. He about 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago, was interviewed, and I want to read to you an excerpt, a short excerpt from this interview, because it's directly relevant to an important message in this presentation. Tom said, "I spent 13 years at NIMH really pushing on the neuroscience and genetics of mental disorders. And when I look back on that, I realize that while I think I succeeded at getting lots of cool, really cool papers published by cool scientists at fairly large costs, I think $20 billion, I don't think we moved the needle in reducing suicide, reducing hospitalizations, improving recovery for the tens of millions of people who have mental illness. I hold myself accountable for that." Tom, at the time he was the director of NIMH, poo-pooed mindfulness and behavioral interventions to cultivate well-being. I think, I know that he has changed. He is, which I respect tremendously. He has been moved by the data. And he is now a great believer in the importance of behavioral interventions. So all of this leads to this conjecture that well-being is a skill that can be learned. And the very same mechanisms that encode suffering, that allow suffering to get under the skin, the mechanisms of neuroplasticity, epigenetics, many other mechanisms, those very same mechanisms can be harnessed for human flourishing. They are the same mechanisms. So what contributes to resilience and flourishing? What are the key pillars of well-being that exhibit plasticity and that can be enhanced through training? And so this is now, I'm going to talk a little bit about a framework that we have been developing that provides an organizational scheme for a lot of what we're doing. This framework was published last year in an article called The Plasticity of Well-Being. And what this framework proposes is that there are 4 key pillars of a healthy mind or well-being. Some of these you will recognize. They show up in other schemes that have been around to describe the components of well-being. Others you won't recognize immediately.Ey're not in any current system for understanding the taxonomy, if you will, of well-being. The first is awareness. It's about being present. It includes mindfulness. It includes attention, self-awareness. It also includes a very important attribute that psychologists and neuroscientists call meta-awareness, knowing what our minds are doing. That may seem strange, but I think all of us have had the experience of reading a book where you might be reading each word on a page, and after you read a page, maybe another page, you realize you have no friggin' idea what you've just read. That is a good example of a lapse of meta-awareness. And the moment we recognize that is a moment of awakening. And I'll say more about each of these pillars in a moment. The second pillar is connection. It's about feeling connected. It's the skills that are important for healthy social relationships, skills like appreciation and kindness and compassion. The third pillar is insight. It's about getting curious about how this entity that we call ourself is actually put together. And it's about self-inquiry, self-knowledge, and self-transcendence. It's understanding how the narrative that we carry around is influencing how we see the world. And most importantly, it's about not so much changing the narrative, but changing our relationship to the narrative. And finally, the last pillar is one that you all recognize, purpose. It's about staying motivated, and it's about clarifying our values and purpose and finding meaning in more and more of what we do on an everyday basis. So I'll just say a little bit more about each of these, and this will also be an opportunity to do some practices associated with a few of them, not with all of them, but we'll do a few of them. I want to first just introduce awareness by introducing William James. Despite the fact that I was a graduate student working in William James Hall, when I was a graduate student, I was not assigned a single page of William James to read, not one page. Fortunately, I discovered William James on my own, And in the Principles of Psychology, written or published in 1890, this 2-volume tome, William James has a whole chapter on attention. And he said in that chapter, the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. No one is compos sui if he have it not. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. But it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical directions for bringing it about. The italics, by the way, are in the original William James. And we've done studies with long-term meditators. This is someone who's very famous, a Tibetan monk by the name of Mingyur Rinpoche, who's written some popular books on meditation. At the time we tested him for the first time, he was in his 20s, and he had already done, based on a very detailed structured interview that we do, he had already done 62,000 hours of formal practice. He had completed 6 years of full-time retreat at that time. He's subsequently done much more. And we started here just to see if there was anything different about their brains, because if we didn't see any signal in these people, we weren't going to see a signal in a person who is just starting. And it turns out that we did see interesting things. We've published those. I'm not going to review any of that. It's just a reminder that this is where this has started. But from a scientific perspective, in certain ways, this work, while interesting and in certain ways important, is ultimately unsatisfying. Because there are so many possible explanations for why these differences might be there, only some of which have to do with meditation. Others could have to do with their lifestyle. There's so many factors that are different about these kind of people. And so we clearly needed to do other kinds of work. So connection, about the qualities that promote healthy social relationships. I want to just share a tidbit of a couple of findings. One is a RCT that we did early on with individuals who never meditated in their life. We randomly assigned them one group to 2 weeks of compassion training, another group, an active control group, to 2 weeks of cognitive reappraisal training that came from cognitive therapy. And we put them in the scanner before and after the 2 weeks of training. We also gave them economic decision-making tasks to look at behavioral measures of altruism, which we hypothesized would be impacted by this compassion training. And what we saw is that the compassion group is showing increased pro-social behavior on the economic decision-making task, and there were systematic changes in the brain. I won't go through the details. This is a circuit involving the connectivity between regions of the prefrontal cortex and the ventral striatum. And there was a strengthening of that connectivity, and that connectivity actually predicted the extent to which they behaved altruistically on this economic decision-making task. Now, I want to share with you a very different set of data. One of the things that we've been doing is over the course of many years, we've tested long-term practitioners who are not monks, but who have day jobs. And who are folks like us. They just have been meditating a long time. And one of the things that we just have routinely done is we take pictures of all the participants in the studies for our records, just a photograph. And we do this with age and gender match controls and with these long-term meditators. One other thing before I get to that. Sorry. Let me tell you about one other different study. And then we'll go back to that one. So one of the folks in our center is a person by the name of Matt Hirschberg. He was a former public school teacher. He has subsequently become an educational psychologist. And there are a lot of data now to suggest that the achievement gap in the US between Black and white students is at least in part driven by what educators have called the discipline gap. The discipline gap is the disproportionate administration of harsh and punitive punishment toward members of racial outgroups. And that's what this particular paper is about. And one of the things that Matt was interested in investigating is whether an intervention of awareness and connection, essentially mindfulness and compassion, would actually reduce behavioral measures of implicit bias, because there's other work to suggest that the discipline, the disproportionate administration of harsh and punitive punishment is done by teachers who report that they're not biased, but on measures of implicit bias, they show such bias. And so we wanted to see if this kind of training over the course of one semester as part of these are pre-service teachers just in their last semester before they go out and become regular teachers. And what we see is that on a measure of implicit bias, both at post-test, immediately at post-test, and at 6-month follow-up, there are significant reductions on this behavioral measure of implicit bias. And other analyses suggest that it was particularly the connection or compassion training that was important in producing these effects. So getting back to the photographs. Photographs are thin slices. So we have these photographs of middle-aged people, some of whom are meditators, some of whom are controls, age and gender match controls. And we decided to give these photographs to naive people and just ask them to rate these photographs. So we'll do a little experiment now. I want you to just say whether the photograph on the left is the meditator or the photograph on the right is the meditator. Which one, left or right? Okay, which one, left or right? Well, it turns out that this is a real effect. And if you look at the ratings, these are ratings of about 350 people. They were not told anything about meditation. They were simply asked to rate these photographs on these dimensions. There's nothing mentioned about meditation whatsoever. And LTM stands for long-term meditator. And what you can see is that the long-term meditators were rated as more comfortable, more conscientious, more mindful, and less neurotic than their age and gender matched counterparts, just based on this photograph. So it implies that there are signals in the face that may be relevant to aspects of well-being that will be interesting to capture and potentially informative and provide another kind of measure, which is something that we're interested in, and we're working on automated methods of scoring the face for this purpose. Okay, insight is really a very important dimension. And let me say that in order to cultivate well-being, we believe that we need all of these. You would never go to the gym and just work out on your upper body. And if all you do, pardon me for saying this, but I will say it, if all you do is mindfulness, it's kind of like just working out on your upper body. You want to be able to nourish the whole system. Now, it may be that some people may benefit most from mindfulness and other people may benefit most from other strategies. The practices in the contemplative traditions to cultivate insight have hardly been studied at all in a modern scientific context. The kind of meditation that the Dalai Lama does every day primarily is insight-based meditation called analytic meditation, which has received virtually zero scientific attention. And this is a very important set of practices which we think will be important for the scientific community to begin to take on. So let's do a little practice because this may be opaque to some of you. And so let's do a little insight analytic practice together. So let's again sit in whatever is a comfortable posture, but one that supports your awakeness. I know it's late, and I'm going to end really soon because I really want to hear Barbara. Let's begin by something important that we always do whenever we do a real period of practice, and that is to simply check in with our motivation and to recognize that practices to calm our mind and open our heart and support our well-being are important not only for ourselves, but they're important for all the others that we connect with directly or indirectly. And actually, putting your butt in a chair or on the cushion is an important act of generosity. Let's begin by simply reflecting for a moment or two on that. And now, let us bring to mind an event in our lives from the recent past, say in the last few weeks, that was an important event. It may have been with family members, it may be something work-related, where there was some degree of challenge, not necessarily the most challenging, but some degree of challenge. And let's bring that event into our mind. And now let's reflect on our beliefs and our expectations that we hold about that event. And specifically the beliefs and expectations that you may have had at that moment, whatever they might have been. It may be assumptions that you are making about another person. It may be a way of holding a certain stereotype. And let's now envision holding a different set of beliefs and expectations. What if we approached the situation differently What if we had a different set of assumptions? And see if you can do a little simulation to discover how your experience might be different. And see if we can glean from this some insight about the workings of our own mind and how it might contribute to certain patterns or styles of interaction. And if we change that, how it might be different. Or if we simply change our relationship to those beliefs and expectations. And as we end this very short period of practice, let's also do something very traditional whenever we practice, and that is whatever insight, whatever benefit you may have gleaned from this very short period of practice, how can we bring that actually out into the world to make a difference, to be of benefit to others? I'm going to just skip a few things in the interest of time, and you can open your eyes for those whose eyes are closed and re-engage. So we have developed this program to train these 4 components of well-being. We have established a nonprofit organization in conjunction with our university center. It's a 501c3. We have created an app based on this, which is freely available throughout the world. We've done no advertising, and we have about 250,000 folks who have downloaded it and have at least tried it. And I would, if anyone is interested, you can go to this website, tryhealthyminds.org, to learn more about it. And these are just data from 2 RCTs that we've recently done. The last one was during COVID, fully remote, with 660 public school teachers in the state of Wisconsin, looking at a measure of distress, which is a combined measure of anxiety, depression, and perceived stress. And it is looking at a 1-month intervention with the app and with a 3-month follow-up showing the benefit. And one of the things that's cool about doing this with the app is we can get from the app data on how much people are practicing. And when we first saw the data, we were a little disturbed by it because the average amount of daily practice by the teachers is 5.5 minutes per day. And yet, the benefit is quite robust. And so just a few things about where this is going and some of these unanswered questions. And I'd like to suggest the possibility of microdosing well-being. And what I mean by that is having very short micro-interventions that can be inserted in the right place at the right time and really could be beneficial. And there's a whole industry of data out there showing that really brief interventions can make an enormous difference, not just at the time of the intervention, but actually if you follow people even for years, interventions less than an hour can have profound effects. So let me give you one example. This is from a values affirmation task looking at minority middle school kids. I just want to read you two things from this abstract. Small but timely experiences can have long-term benefits. In the second study, the intervention, which is less than about an hour of time of this values affirmation intervention, increased African Americans' probability of college enrollment 7 to 9 years later, based on an intervention that lasted an hour. And this is not an isolated study. There are other studies out there. There's this amazing graduate student at Penn that I just met, and I want to just, I mean, he's extraordinary. He's the first author of this paper. I just met this guy, Akash Wazil, in a meeting at the World Bank. And he's been doing these single session interventions with graduate students, with Kenyan adolescents in India, just single sessions that last less than an hour and that have profound long-term effects. And so this is something I think we need to look seriously in. There are also sensitive periods of development. And we're doing a bunch of work with first-year college students, with high school students. These are all adolescent work. And we really are interested in impacting the gender difference in depression. Some of you may know that if you look at the prevalence of depression in boys and girls before adolescence, it's equal. After adolescence, it's twice in girls than what it is in boys. And we think that if you intervene at the right time, we can actually reduce this. During pregnancy, there's a lot of talk about the intergenerational transmission of trauma. What about the intergenerational transmission of resilience and awakening? And there are data that show that a mother's well-being during pregnancy, her demeanor, her emotional processing, influences neurodevelopment in the fetus. We've published data showing that white matter connectivity within the first month of life is impacted by the mother's well-being during pregnancy. So we're now doing intervention studies in pregnant women in the second trimester of pregnancy, and our main outcome variable is the development of the baby and brain development that we can monitor in the first months of life, and you can get measures from the cord blood and look at many signals in the cord blood that can provide you a snapshot of the epigenetic status of the fetus. And of course, also aging, which is something that is obviously important to this group. New targets of interventions, sensitivity to misinformation, moral decision-making, ecological awareness, and ecological decision-making, citizen engagement, and I would argue that the very future of democracy really depends on the kinds of skills that can be cultivated in this way. And just to give you a couple of examples, this is a study that was published in 2021 with a mindfulness-based nature intervention that included some nature looking at pro-environmental behavior, actual behavioral measures. And the data suggest that this mindfulness-based nature intervention actually promoted increased pro-environmental behavior. We need to be doing this and getting it out there. This is just from a review of Paul Grossman and his colleagues looking at this meta-analysis of just a few studies that have been done, looking at this sort of thing. This is a weak effect, but we need to tweak these interventions, create hybrid interventions that include both the contemplative training and other elements that may be relevant. This is from the Journal of Business Venturing, looking at the effects of a loving kindness meditation on entrepreneurs' sustainable decision-making. These are entrepreneurs who run large organizations and whose impact is going to be multiplicative. And the data show that a simple short-term intervention can have beneficial effects on sustainable decision-making. And there's also some hints, and I don't want to oversell this, but there are some hints that this kind of training may help to resist misinformation. And these are data also from well, this came out a few years ago, looking at an experimental paradigm that is really about misinformation. And if you insert a brief, this is really a micro intervention, a brief micro mindfulness intervention at the right place, it actually will reduce a person's susceptibility to the false memory effect. So I think this is best regarded as an urgent public health need. We need to nourish our mind to change the world. We're trying to do this, but we need everyone to do this. And I want to end with one of my favorite quotes. This is from a book that was on the bestseller list for some time by the Dalai Lama called The Art of Happiness. And he said, the systematic training of the mind, the cultivation of happiness, the genuine inner transformation by deliberately selecting and focusing on positive mental states and challenging negative mental states is possible because of the very structure and function of the brain. But the wiring in our brains is not static, not irrevocably fixed. Our brains are also adaptable. So thank you all so much. I appreciate your attention. And we all have to look forward to Barbara Bogutsin's wonderful cello. Thank you.